Welcome to the I Made a podcast, where we hear from podcasters about what they've learned since starting their own show, so you can do the same. And now, here's your host, Chris Creary.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of I Made a Podcast. I'm so glad that you're here. You're either on the fence about starting a podcast, you want to learn new tips and tricks about podcasting, or if you're already a podcaster, you're trying to get better in what you're doing, and you are in the absolute best place to learn about podcasting right now. So I'm glad that you're here watching or listening right now, and whatever you're doing, I hope that you take notes, because this is going to be another wonderful episode. I spoke with Sam Mitchell today. Now, if you haven't heard about him, you're going to hear about him in a second, but he has such an awesome podcast. Now, this is the second time that I had to actually interview him, because the first time there were some internet issues and I couldn't really make out what he was saying on his side. So I had to connect with him again and schedule another interview. So while we were doing this interview, he was actually in his car on the way somewhere. But it's so amazing technology that it sounds so perfectly clear. You can't even hear any of the road noise around him while we were talking and doing this interview. So check it out, listen to it, and you'll see how amazing it sounds. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I say that to say that I have a podcasting cheat sheet, and it has a list of all of these resources that you could use for your podcast. So even if you're driving, like in this case where Sam was driving during the interview, we still were able to get some great sounding audio, and I use one of the apps that are on my cheat sheet, which I will get to in a second, and it was absolutely free. So this is something that's out there that can help you. So if you're a podcaster, if you want to learn new tips, tricks, tools, things that you can use to get better sounding audio, get my cheat sheet. It's in the description. Just download it, and you can use that, use some of the resources, and you don't have to spend a dime. Now, to get to this interview with Sam, get your pen, your notepad, and make sure that you're taking notes. And there's some amazing things that he talked about and some wonderful things that he's doing to get on stages, sponsorships, and monetization. So much amazing things that he's doing. So let's get into this interview with Sam, and I'll be back at the end of this episode to wrap things up. So today, we're talking about your podcast, which is called Autism Rocks and Rolls. And maybe just to get started, can you introduce yourself to everyone listening? Introduce yourself, your podcast, and let us know a little bit about you.
Yeah, so what I do is I run a podcast called Autism Rocks Rolls. It's about autism and how we cope with daily struggles that you may or may not understand. Through the podcast, it's grown so much. I developed sponsors, a nonprofit, a board of 8. I plan events in Indianapolis, where I'm from. We're just got done with a summer concert and now working on a motorcycle poker run. And I also am a motivational speaker. I've spoken in Oklahoma, Orlando 3 times, Canada twice, Stuart, Florida, Washington, D.C., soon to be speaking in Daniels, West Virginia.
So all of these things that you have done, have they come as a result of your podcast?
Yes, they have came as a result of my podcast.
Wow, that's amazing. So we're going to have to get into it to understand how other people listening who are started podcasts can use their podcast as a platform to do other things like how you are doing. So let's talk about your podcast. So how often do you release new episodes, and what's the length of your episodes?
Every 13 day, and the episodes variety. It could be 30 minutes. It could be 48. It could be an hour, over an hour. The latest one I had was 38. So that's where I typically keep it in.
Right. Wonderful. And now, how long have you been in podcasting?
Since October 2019, brother. It started, I found my high school's media club. They'll love it ever since. Knew I had to continue I had to know I had to continue my own media skills. I didn't want to wait till college to expand them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's awesome. And so you started as a result of being in your media club at high school. So that's actually really good, because I was listening to some of your episodes and the audio quality is very good. So I guess they probably showed you the tips, the tricks in order to get good audio on your podcast. What types of things did you learn when you were starting your podcast, or through the media club in your high school?
Learning about the audio, the tips and tricks, how to amplify, how to get rid of dead space, get rid of the
filler words. Yep.
Filler words, exactly.
Yeah. And one thing that you mentioned also, I think it's really important to kind of emphasize this as well. You you started podcasting and then you realized that you didn't want to give it up. So you continued doing it, even though you were not in your high school media club any longer, which is, I think, something that as podcasters, if you feel like you are in something and you feel that motivation to continue doing it, to continue to persevere, I say continue to do it, because that tells you that you're making impact in the world, and especially with what your podcast is about. Now, so it's called Autism Rocks and Rolls. Why did you decide to make a podcast about autism and about your situation and your story?
Because of the stigmas and BS I've been dealing with my whole entire life. Is part of the reason, but it was also perfect timing. When I was starting the podcast, what I was noticing around me was the autism spectrum population was growing.
That's excellent insight, because we need to be aware of like what's going on around us when we are going to start a podcast, and see how we can kind of, for lack of a better word, kind of ride the wave and break the stigma, or break the cloudy areas or the gray areas that people may have concerning a specific thing. And it's excellent that you're doing this podcast to get knowledge and insight and information out there to educate other people, so that we can all learn about how to work with people, to engage with people daily, because like you said, the population of people who have autism or who are on the spectrum is increasing. I've noticed it. You said you've noticed it. So I'm so glad that you were tackling this topic and putting information out there to help everybody. So I would encourage everybody to go onto your podcast and listen to your episodes, listen to some of the things that you talk about. I'm going to put links for all of your podcasts down below in the description of this episode. So everyone listening right now, if you want to listen to Sam's podcast called Autism Rocks and Rolls, it's in the description. You can go down there and click the links, follow his podcast. And Sam, I'm sure it's on like all of the podcasts and apps that are out there, right?
Yes, sir. It's been on there on all your favorite media platforms. Not hard guy to find. Just type in Autism Rocks and Rolls. Something will pop up.
Wonderful. Yeah. And like I said, I make it easy. I put links in the description, so just go there. So let's talk about like some of the guests that you have had on your podcast. Can you tell me about maybe like the best episode that you had, or one of the most popular guests that you have had on your podcast? Because I know that there have been a few. So can you share maybe what was the best episode you've ever done?
Oh, gee whiz, man. That's a hard one. There's a lot of good ones. I've had a lot of autism advocates on the show. I've had the biggest autistic advocate out there, probably Dr. Temple Grandin. I've also had lots of professional wrestlers. Wow. Mick Foley's a big name. Kane's a big name. Buff Bagwell, Victoria, Raven, Al Snow, and RVD.
Wow. So like how, because I'm thinking, one of the challenges that I've heard from other podcasters is how do they get guests, like finding people to have on their podcast. How did you go about making these connections with all these people, professional wrestlers, speakers? How did you go about making these connections and getting them on your podcast?
Finally, I just asked. I literally just asked, will you please be on my show? And I give a whole script of who I am. I don't just say, hey, I'm Sam Mitchell, want to come on? Nah. I let them know what I've done. The bio I have is pretty much my resume.
Mm-hmm.
What I also do, though, to help myself out is I have to take the initiative. That's advice for podcasters right there.
Yes.
This is for men or women, but you want to get your podcast out there, and it involves growing a pair of testicles.
Okay. So in other words, you're saying that you need to be bold.
In retrospect, yes.
Okay.
I know it came across as harsh there, but
it's all good.
The only way you're going to go out there and make this successful, if you want big names on, you got to find the publicist. If you get lucky, you can have some connections. Mick Foley was through connections through a fellow wrestling podcast I was on, but some of them were literally just asking. RVD was Facebook Messenger. Victoria was literally asking at the Square Circle Expo I went to. Brad Loakley, a famous comedian from World's Dumbest, was literally an email.
Wow, wonderful. So the takeaway from that comment, though, I would say is be bold, be committed to what you're doing, and just go out there and ask. I mean, the worst that can happen is someone say no. And if they say no, you're in the same place that you are as if you didn't ask. So That you just need to be bold and go out there and ask and invite these people onto your podcast. I mean, and the worst, I mean, if they say yes, that's a win. If they say no, then you're in the same place. Thanks for that.
You have to brush off the no's too. I've been told no many millions and millions of times, brother. I got more no's than yeses. And if you're not willing to take the no's, I'd highly recommend not inviting big people on your platform.
Right. Yeah. It might take a million no's to get to that yes. But when you do get that one yes, it is absolutely worth it. So thank you for that insight. And I think we need to get over this. I don't know what it's called, or if it's a complex or whatever that people have where they're afraid to take risk, afraid to step out because of the fear of being rejected. So I'm actually reading the book right now called Rejection Proof that talks about overcoming that fear of being rejected. So I would encourage other people to read that book as well. Are there ways that you have monetized your podcast, or what have you done to bring in some revenue with your podcast? Because I recognize when I listen to your podcast that there are some sponsorships and things that you have on your podcast. So what are you doing? How are you bringing in revenue with your podcast?
It's the main way I make money, through the sponsorship, but I also make money through the events and the speaking engagements outside the nonprofit. To me, the only way you're going to make money with your podcast is if you have a nonprofit on the side.
Mm-hmm. So you have your podcast and it's connected to a nonprofit organization, and then through that nonprofit, you're going out and you're asking for sponsorships for various companies supporting your nonprofit, basically.
Correct.
Okay, makes sense. Now, in terms of the asking for sponsorships, are you preparing like a media kit or a sponsorship kit that you're creating that you give to potential sponsors? Or are you just, again, like when you are finding guests, are you just reaching out and just emailing or messaging companies and asking them for sponsorship? How are you going about that step of finding sponsors for your podcast?
Well, before we met last night, because we previously recorded it with technology issues,
yeah,
I didn't have a media kit actually, but since I've been on your show previously, I was able to develop a media kit with certain benefits you receive and certain prizes you can get through ad spaces. How long it is, 15, 36, you just increases 15 seconds, basic math. But that's how we did it.
Wonderful. So you give this to potential sponsors, they look it over, and then they can decide if they want to sponsor you or not after reading over everything that you presented to them, basically, right?
Right. The best way to do it is what I did was 2 times in my time when I was starting. I think I mentioned in the previous recording, I took a sponsorship field trip day, as I called it. Basically, I went to my 2 biggest towns close to me with a lot of people, and I went pretty much to every company that existed that wasn't corp like Walmart or Kroger, but there was a local bakery. You bet your bottom dollar I asked, would you sponsor?
Wonderful. So you call that a sponsorship field trip. So that's so awesome. I love that. So you just basically went out there, going to local businesses, asking them if they want to sponsor your podcast. So it's called, you called it a sponsorship field trip. I absolutely love that. Now, in terms of like promotion, what are you doing to get the word out about your podcast to get people to listen?
Well, I go on several Facebook forums. One of them was called Need a Guest.
Yep.
It's Be a Guest, Find a Guest. You probably heard those terms when you advertise. I go on Matchmaker. I find several podcasts online. I use the internet itself because the internet's pretty darn big.
Yep.
And then I've also posted myself with a bio. Example is I just posted one recently. Over 100 people liked it. So I can definitely tell I'm doing something right.
Wow. Awesome. I hope that maybe my mind is blown when you say that. You say it and it sounds so simple. Maybe what we can do, maybe you can send me a link or an example of one of those posts that you made that you used to promote your podcast. And I could probably use it as a template and share it along with the notes for this episode so that people can see what you were doing and maybe learn from what you were doing and, put their own podcasts or their own information out there so that they can use the same template that you're using to promote their podcast. Now, are you on social media, or do you do any promotion on social media like Instagram or TikTok or anything like that?
Not as much. I say those for the big time ordeals going down with our company.
Can you elaborate any more about that? Like, how do those big deals work?
Well, it's events. Look who we saw today. Example. Maybe we saw Victoria when I went to go commentate the local wrestling show. Look who I saw. Make sure to tagline it. Or it could be we're having our gala coming up. Be sure to look at what's coming down. Or we also have our gala happen. Look what went down during it.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, okay, so you talked about a gala coming up and everything like that. Now let's get into like some of the speaking engagements that you have had, because you mentioned a few places. I think you said Orlando, Canada, some other places that you have had speaking engagements at those locations at the big events. How did you manage to get those speaking engagements through your podcast? Did people just find your podcast and say, "Hey, I want to have this guy on my podcast," or did you reach out to them, or how did that work? How did those speaking engagements come about?
Well, I call them work trips too, because it's a vacation, but I'm working by speaking clearly.
Mm-hmm.
What I've done is I've asked some. I mean, I paid the price for some of them, but then there are also cases where they have came to me and found me on social media. Oklahoma found me. This Daniels, West Virginia, somehow found about me. What platform did they find me on? Answer, I have no idea.
Wow, that's so awesome. But you know what? You know what I will say? You're putting yourself out there, and that's the thing about the internet. When you continue to produce content and put yourself out there, eventually the right type of people will find you. And those people who you are, I guess, for lack of a better word, marketing your podcast for, they will eventually find you. And I guess that's what's happening here in your situation. Now, you alluded to this before. So this is actually the second time that we are having this conversation. The first time we were doing it, some technical issues with regards to the internet, and I couldn't use that recording, which is, unfortunate. But I did get to talk to you again, and we were going over a lot of the things that we talked about the first time. But I'm kind of just moving into like some of the challenges that, you may have as a podcaster. One, the internet issues that we had when we did this the first time. But can you explain maybe some of the other challenges that you have faced as a podcaster since 2019 when you started?
Well, the internet's one, but
Yep.
the anxiety I have with the internet, let's call it that. I am so nervous with the internet, it won't do its job. You have to rely on something, and I'm the type of person who hates relying on something in order to do the job.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one kicker. I'm just like, really? Really? And you can't, smack the internet like you could a child. I'm not saying I believe it's faking or anything. It's just, with children in general, you can teach. Technology,
Exactly.
you can't teach.
Well, some people can debate that with AI and machine learning and stuff like that you could eventually teach them. But I hear what you're saying, because it's hard to because technology, certain things are out of your control, right? When it doesn't want to work as it's expected to work. So it's out of your control. So you can't really do anything about it. If, like, for example, when we're recording this right now, it's middle of July. Just on Friday last week, you may have heard of the big technology outage with CrowdStrike and Windows servers. And all of these companies couldn't do anything because their servers were down. They had to implement a workaround in order to get it working again. But that's an example of when technology doesn't work and it's really somewhat out of your control to get things to work again. So I hear what you're saying. Now, is there any other challenges that you want to mention with regards to podcasting, or anything that you have faced since you started?
Well, I hate people backing out on me.
Yeah.
It's punctuality. I think in the broadcasting world, you're high on punctuality.
Absolutely.
And you have to feel others backing out on you. It's very aggravating. Then you have to come up with a topic like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? If I have to get another person, I got to have to create my own notes again. And thankfully, that's been a lot easier as time's gone on. But still, like, come on. It's such a pain in the rear.
Yeah, I echo that sentiment as well, because this podcast is predominantly an interview-based podcast. And I think that there was one person that I was trying to get, I think maybe 3 times, and they didn't show up. Didn't even send me a message to say what the reason was, or, I'm going to be late or whatever the case is. They were just no shows twice. So I gave them a chance the first time, and second time they didn't show up again. I was just like, okay, what do you want me to do now? Like I can't, and I'm here and I'm prepared and I'm ready, and they don't show up. But I think I don't know what we can do, and maybe other people listening, podcasters, can maybe give their insight of how we can help to get those people to show up. If there's anything that we can do proactively. I mean, we could send reminders and all these things, but life happens, things happen, and maybe sometimes people just don't show up. Now, with regards to your podcast, what do you use? Like some of your tools and your the tools and the platforms that you use to do your podcast, either software and hardware. What do you use, Sam?
I use Audacity. I've also, since we talked last, I started an internship at a radio station, so I'm getting more familiar with Adobe.
Ah, nice.
Adobe Audition.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also use this tool called Adobe Sound Enhancer. So Adobe Sound Enhancer, I have to use my laptop to record, and with the computer, through experience, it sounds awful. Mm-hmm. It sounds garbage. But what I've used with Adobe Sound Enhancer is it can make your interview sound like it's professional. There's no background noise, and there isn't any echoes or the phone voice, as I call it.
Right. Yeah. Now, is this like a free program, or do you have to pay for this?
There's a free version, but then if you want to do drop-in files that are more than an hour, you have to pay a little bit, and I think it's worth it.
I'm gonna try it. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna take this interview and I'm gonna run it through Adobe Sound Enhancer and see what happens. This is awesome. And you said so it has a free portion to it, but there is limits with that free portion. I think you said an hour's worth of.
I think it might be 30 minutes. I'm just not 100% sure what the hour is.
That's fine. I think because what I have, and I've mentioned this before in other episodes, I have a podcast and cheat sheet that I have available. I tell everybody about it because I have a list of resources, softwares, and hardware, and a lot of the software that I have on that list, there's a free element to them, so you can actually use it and get some benefit in your podcast. So I think I'm going to try this one, and I probably will add it onto my cheat sheet. And for anyone listening out there, if you want to get access to the cheat sheet, I've put a list of it in the description of this episode. Just go there and you can download it and have a list of that cheat sheet.
I will, and I checked it out. They've got some pretty good tools on there. I just need to find time to use them.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of tools there. So everyone go get the cheat sheet. Now, when it comes to like your room setup, do you have like any special soundproofing or treatment in your room to get the sound quality to that higher level? How does your room look like when it comes to your podcast and setup?
It's sound panels, but they like to fall off easy.
Yeah, absolutely. Eh? Oh man, that's so funny. Do you have anything else? Like, how big is your room?
Not too big. It's just a small little hinky-dinky studio.
Mm-hmm. So you say about 5 by 5?
5 by 5, sure. We can go with that.
Yeah. So it's not too big. So that's good because it doesn't give you a lot of echo in the room, and you have your sound paneling on your wall. But what I'm guessing though is that you run everything through Adobe Sound Enhancer. So even if there is echo, that program will clean it up completely, right?
ACAM would be so there's an acronym with my interview. There's APE, and I don't have to really do it when I'm at my home studio. It's when I'm going back to college and I can't go home because my college is an hour away. I have to run it through Adobe Sound Enhancer to get rid of the echo. Mm-hmm. Whereas I record at home, there's not really much echo.
I guess the advice for all the podcasters out there is if you can eliminate some of these echoes or additional noise in your room setup, you don't need to run it through some of these sound enhancing programs that we mentioned here. But most people don't have access to like a perfect sounding room or acoustically treated room where they can get rid of all of the echo, all of the background noise. I mean, like I'm here now, if a helicopter flies overhead or if a fire truck goes up the street, the microphone is going to pick it up, right? But I know that if I run it through maybe Adobe Sound Enhancer or some of the other programs that I have, it will eliminate all of those background noises. So sometimes you can use your room and isolate the room so that this additional sounds don't come in. Other times you can use programs like we mentioned here to get rid of background noises and stuff like that. So that's excellent. Thank you for sharing that, Sam. Now, final question that I have for you. Now, is there any last piece of wisdom or insight that you want to share with any of the podcasters listening, or if there's anything I may have forgotten to ask you that you want to share?
Well, it's not really much advice as in it's just, I think, how the world should be. If the world could be nice and not act so stupid, I think we get along so much better, don't you think?
Absolutely, 100%. If we treat other people how we want to be treated, it'll be such a wonderful place. So that is such an excellent point to end this episode on. Sam, thank you so much for coming to take the time out of your day to be on I Made a Podcast. Thank you for sharing all of this insight and this wisdom that you shared with us today. As I mentioned before, I put links for all of your podcasts and your social medias and everything down in the description. Anyone listening, you can go and listen to Sam's podcast. It's called Autism Rocks and Rolls. So go check it out. It is a good listen, and you will learn a lot through listening to Sam's podcast. So Sam, thank you so much for being on I Made a Podcast today. This was a great episode.
All right, everyone, that was another episode of I Made a Podcast. Now, I hope that you learned something. Now, at the beginning of the episode, I did say that Sam was driving, and if you were watching it, you could see that he was in his car while we were doing this interview. Now, one of the things that I used was that app that he mentioned, which is Adobe Sound Enhancer, and it was able to clear off all of the background noise and give us such crisp, perfect sound and audio. Now, again, get my podcast and cheat sheet. That app is on there, and so many other apps are on there. And what I'm going to do next week is I'm actually going to do some testing. I'm going to record some audio in very terrible sounding places, and I'm going to let you listen to the before and the after so that you can see the difference and show you the tools that I use for this podcast and that are on my podcast and cheat sheet. So you can use them, you can see the difference, and you can go to get the cheat sheet and use them as well. So I'm going to show you how to use them next week on I Made a Podcast. So make sure that you subscribe on any one of the podcasts and apps out there so you can listen to that episode. But you can also watch it on YouTube. So go on to YouTube, I Made a Podcast, and click the subscribe button and the notification button or whatever it is that you have to press so that you know when I release a new episode. And that's all I have to say for this episode. Remember, the best time to start a podcast was 10 years ago. The second best time is right now. And I'm here to help you make it happen. So let's do it. And I'll talk to you next week on I Made a Podcast. Peace.